If Alexander the Great had lived past the age of 32, he would have expanded Macedonia to control Carthage, Iberia, southern Gaul, Italy, Dacia, Scythia, Arabia, Nubia, and even, eventually, the entirety of India. If you want to see his military campaigns, click here. If you can get the video to 3,000 likes, a sequel to this will be made. The result of these gargantuan conquests would be an empire that spanned over most of the known world, and controlled hundreds of different cultures. His empire included Greeks, Lydians, Egyptians, Jews, Persians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Sumerians, Medes, Iranians, Sogdians, Parthians, Bactrians, Illyrians, Paeonians, Thracians, Dacians, Scythians, Bosphorans, Armenians, Italics, Siciliots, Carthaginians, Berbers, Libyans, Iberians, Celtiberians, Galaicae, Aquitani, Celts, Ligures, Etruscans, Romans, Nabateans, Nubians, Arabians, Vedics, Mauryans, and Dravidians. Each of these people had their own subcultures and distinctive religions. Many were polytheistic, except the Jews and Persians. In order to try and unify people from parts of the world that shared virtually nothing in common, Alexander had moved over 40 million people to establish a new imperial ethnicity and culture. Many people of the Mediterranean already spoke Greek, as there were Greek colonists and traders around for hundreds of years at that point. Because of this, the Mediterranean regions would Hellenize far quicker than the other parts of the empire. The Greeks had much better relations with the native populations than Romans had in our timeline, as they were more viewed as trade partners, not as subjugators. Cities would play a critical role in Hellenization. Throughout its reign, thousands of Greek cities were built throughout the empire. All were built in new Greek styles of grids, massive Greek temples, and walls. As tons of people had been pushed to move throughout the empire, many of them would end up in cities. These cities would become bastions of Hellenic culture in barbarian lands. And in turn, city dwellers would become more Hellenized, and far quicker than rural folk, who were not around Greek culture and practices as much. The new culture would have been Hellenic, but certainly not Greek. Elements from various different cultures were incorporated into the imperial identity. The most barbarian aspect to the Greeks would have been the adoption of proskynesis. Alexander would be bowed down to like a god by many of his subjects. Probably not the Greeks, but the practice would have been common among other cultures. The language for the empire would be Greek, but each region would have their own dialect evolve over time, similar to Latin had in our own time. It's hard to say what a combined culture would have looked like, but I'm basing this off both the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, two Macedonian successors who had success fusing the Hellenic culture into the respective Persian and Egyptian ones. The structure of power in different places would not be rebuilt from the ground up, but instead adopted by Alexander. Some places would have local kings, some would maintain republics. While there was a combination, Alexander had a delicately balanced power to fill the numerous voids, while stopping his Greek allies from feeling alienated by the government. The administrative languages would have all shifted to Greek, but Alexander would be both a Greek to the Greeks and a barbarian to the barbarians. Much of the bureaucracy was the same as before Alexander took power, so he sent his various generals and allies all throughout the empire to fill new empty roles. Some of his allies would become kings, others would end up governing over a republic. This system would allow Alexander to focus entirely on propaganda for himself. This image would initially be viewed poorly, but as his reign became the norm and many of the youths attended the new Greek schools, his image became very popular. He may have been deified and viewed as a god-king who gifted civilization to the world. Many Greek practices would be normalized throughout the army, and in turn, slowly creep their way into civilian life as soldiers began to return home. A major one of these would be burial rites. Proper Greek burials would be mandatory for the army, and while there would be no secular mandate by Alexander, it would slowly become the common practice. The economy would be another gradual shift of the culture. As the empire expanded, markets increased dramatically, as people were now open to far more goods and trades. The economy would be a combination of the traditional economies of different regions, but with new Greek supervision and minor tweaks to expedite it. The most obvious use of these power in the economy would be through coins. Eventually, Alexander would mint new coins that would show the empire as one unit, not a combination of many places. Local currencies would slowly be phased out until the gold stateres and silver tetradrachms would become the only currency accepted. This change would eliminate certain bartering practices that were still relatively common during that time and streamline goods for all parties. These changes were not major, but it empowered Alexander to allow the people to remain stable with their lives while also improving upon them. The most obvious example of cultural change would be in religion. As he conquered more land, he began fusing the religious practices if possible, while still offering compliant states some religious liberties. In real life, he granted the Jews complete religious freedom and gave them tons of valuable gifts. He was not perfect, though, and severely cracked down on Zoroastrianism in real life. Combining the Mediterranean faiths would be easier than you may think. At that point, there were already joint Greek-Egyptian temples where both parties recognized a deity as the same, but that they worshipped different aspects of him or her. This practice was known as Interpretatio Graeca. Numerous deities were viewed as the same throughout Hellenic, Egyptian, Punic, Celtic, Etruscan, Roman, Mesopotamian, and Indian faiths. When new temples were built in cities, the different aspects of these gods would be worshipped by the different peoples. This allowed Celts to worship Tautus, Greeks to worship Ares, Romans to worship Mars, Etruscans to worship Laren, Egyptians to worship Anur, Sumerians to worship Nergal, and Indians to worship Kartikeya. While not all the gods had identical counterparts in different faiths, most cultures had similar pantheons. Obviously, the practices would have to be shifted and tweaked to harmonize them successfully, but the process would be easier than you may think. This was only possible because Alexander was undoing 4,000 years of human migration and population changes within a single lifetime. The reason people from Iberia to India had similar deities is because of the Indo-European migrations, which lasted from 4000 to 1000 BC. These were a massive series of migrations that originated from the European steppe. People migrated throughout Europe, the Middle East, and India. This is why many of these languages and deities from various cultures were similar, despite being thousands of miles apart. Today, all of these languages are a part of the Indo-European language family, which 42% of the world, 3.2 billion people, speak today. The most glaring example of religious similarities is between the supreme sky fathers of the Greeks, Romans, and Hindus. There was Zeus, who was sometimes written as Zeu Pater in Greek, Jupiter for the Romans, and Deus Pater for the Hindus. All three are thought to have originated from the Indo-European sky god, Deus. Each of them were the supreme sky being, who was one of the most powerful figures in their pantheons. Here's a chart of all deities who were believed to be the same across various different cultures. Major gods like Apollo, Artemis, Athena, Gaia, Hades, Hephaestus, Hera, Heracles, Hermes, Poseidon, and Zeus all had similar roles throughout the different religions. The point in all of this is that Alexander was unknowingly putting back together a puzzle that nobody even knew existed. Throughout his life, Alexander would have taken many wives, as polygamy was allowed in Macedonian culture. In real life, he married 3 women, Roxana of Sogdia, and 2 daughters of Darius, Statiera and Perisatis. As he continued expanding, he would have married many more women. I believe he would have married women from Macedonia, Carthage, Iberia, the Etruscans, Rome, and India. While 9 wives seems like a lot, his father Philip married 7 women, so it's certainly not impossible. These marriages would have resulted in Alexander having many sons with valid claims to the throne, which puts us now at a crossroads for what would to come. Either Alexander's empire would quickly collapse after his death, as it did in our timeline, or his empire would continue on and take the place of the Roman Empire. If his empire was to collapse, it would be immediately after his death. He may have refused to name an heir like he did in real life. This would instantly pit brothers against each other, and generals stationed in far reaches of the empire made it clear themselves kings of their satrap. The most extreme example was in India. Coriolanus, a Roman who governed the city of Alexandria Epiliotis, allied with Aretas, the Nabatean ruler of Alexandria Erythrea. They declared themselves the joint kings of India, and gathered together an army to invade China, as they heard rumors that the lands were full of warring states and was ripe for conquest. The western regions of the empire would also declare independence. The reality of Alexander's reign became apparent, that people viewed him as a narcissistic despot. By trying to make everyone's culture one, he made a culture for nobody. The migrations had been a complete disaster, and the people hated being a world away from their real homes. Different groups would band together and try to travel home across the empire. This would lead to a massive increase of banditry, and many of the groups would turn into wandering mercenaries that looted and destroyed everything in their sight. Everything had devolved into complete anarchy. Almost everyone would hate Alexander and Macedonia. Alexander IV would rule after him, and he tried to murder as many of his brothers as he could to eliminate any rivals. The Greeks would later rebel, and the Persians quickly followed suit. The empire would survive in some state, but as Alexander IV had successive rulers, the leadership became worse and worse. As time went on, the empire became weaker and smaller, till eventually, within 300 years of Alexander's death, the empire was completely destroyed by various civil and external wars. However, This would be the worst case scenario, and Alexander's migrations may have been successful. Because he reigned for so long, his rule began to be viewed as the norm, not the exception. The many temples full of shared deities promoted unity among strangers. The economic reforms made many of the lower class people wealthier. Many people began to view themselves as both culturally X and Macedonian. There's a very good chance that Alexander would name Alexander IV his heir from a young age. As Alexander IV had fought many campaigns, troops all throughout the empire loved him. He became very popular with both Greeks and barbarians and was seen as a symbol of hope because of his mixed Greek and Sogdian blood. The elite class of the empire were pleased with him and viewed him as a perfect man to follow his father. Any other claims of the throne were crushed before they could start. When Alexander finally passed away, a massive temple would be built in Pella. It would be the largest building ever constructed, towering over the pyramids in size and splendor. After his death, Alexander IV would have his disloyal siblings killed to prevent future insurrections, just as Alexander did with his own siblings. He was crowned hegemon of the world in Pella in 273. He would not go on any invasions as the empire was already stretched to its capacity. Alexander IV consolidated the empire even more and continued to scatter and migrate disloyal populations throughout his empire. Rebellions would break out still, just as it would happen to Rome when they had new emperors. The most major of these would have been in India and Persia. By 270, he put the Persians back in their place and marched into India to face off against Coriolanus and Aretas. Their joint invasion of China had been a complete disaster and they were greatly weakened. Alexander crushed them in a series of battles before destroying their cause in 264, at the Battle of Sanati. While he was fighting in the east, various western regions would declare independence, but his brother, Achilles, who was both Celtiberian and Greek, would crush both Rome and Carthage in these battles. These were the last major rebellions during his reign. There were some minor, various rebellions that were crushed, but the last major rebellion for the empire took place in Central Asia against the Parthians. These wars lasted over 20 years and saw Philip III, the next hegemon after Alexander IV, finally beat them by 247. By 200 BC, his empire had established its own identity. The fusions of religion worked well, and Greek culture had begun to seep its way throughout the world. It is impossible to say how long the empire would have been able to last, as there would be no major external threats for the next 600 years, if things externally played out the same way they did with Rome. As the empire continued to grow, eventually a new capital would be needed for the empire with a more central location. You guys had a lot of good suggestions in the comments in the last video, with Alexandria, Babylon, a new city on the Red Sea, Persepolis. The closest was Antioch. In this timeline, Antioch never would have been founded, as in real life it was founded by Seleucus in 300 BC, which wouldn't have happened here. In real life though, Alexander founded the city of Alexandretta nearby, so this would probably be built up as a new capital at some point. The empire would fight some wars against China, but they would never maintain a foothold in lands so distant from their home. I do not believe they would have ever tried to push into northern Europe, as the land was underdeveloped and not rich enough when compared to the splendors of the east. I'm sure there would have still been some conflicts in the west, but there probably would not have been any full-scale invasions into Gaul or Germania like Rome had. This would have prevented many of these peoples from unifying, and they may stay as individual tribes for hundreds of years longer. The main reason chieftains like Vercingetorix and Arminius were able to gather massive armies was because of a looming Roman threat. If there was no fear of a Macedonian invasion, I doubt these people would unify until at least the 800s, and the Vikings did in our own time. I don't know what would have hurt Macedonia more than what hurt Rome, but it's really impossible to say something so far off and speculative. If the empire was able to survive for hundreds more years, there would be plenty of political changes and bad rulers. While examining Rome, out of their 180 or so emperors, which spanned from Augustus to Constantine XI, and lasted 1,480 years, they really only had 22 great emperors, which is about 12%. This just goes to show that despite tons of incompetent and evil leaders, one good one can be far more impactful. I believe the Macedonian Empire could stay together for that long if they were able to survive the first 200 years or so of revolution. After around 200 maybe 300 years, people would grow used to being in an empire that large and rebellions would slowly fade out. Hundreds of years later, in the early 400s, word spread to hegemon Alexander XVI that a massive horde was sweeping across the steppe and had attacked the Bosphorus. Alexander XVI asked who these people were, and the messenger replied, "The Huns." If you guys enjoyed the video, get it to 3,000 likes and I will continue on with the series. That's my best guess on what would have happened, so let me know what you think would have happened and which of these scenarios is more likely. Click here to watch some other alternate histories. Goodbye.